very much. I forgot my my bell at STIAS when I was coming down, but it's very nice to see all of you. Thank you very much for coming to attend our public lecture, STIAS public lecture. Some of you, we've been seeing you quite a number of times, and others, we're pleased that you're here. We're particularly also pleased that the leaderships of the African research and scholarly networks happen to be here having a 2.5 days conference at STIAS. And so we took advantage of that to also have them come and participate in the public lectures that STIAS work gives in partnership with the Stellenbosch University. So again, we thank the Stellenbosch University for giving us this space and this opportunity of exposing the fellows that we have at STIAS when they're here. So for this particular public lecture, I made sure that I'm not the one who introduces the speaker tonight, because she comes from my university. So I would have had to declare conflict of interest and all those things. And so we are thankful to Professor Amanda Okau, who accepted to introduce our speaker today. Amanda is a professor of political science, but she also holds the South African chair for politics, gender politics, that order, gender politics, and she's very, very keenly involved in this process. And we thought that she would be the right person to introduce. My name is Edward, Professor Edward Chirumira. I'm sure that people know that I now claim to be the new director, no longer new director of STIAS, but the director of STIAS since January this year. And it gives me great pleasure to see that all of us are joining in making sure, in claiming and reclaiming their space as scholars in the development of the continent in conversation with the rest of the world, so that we don't leave it to the politicians. They're very good persons. They need to work together with us. So Professor Amanda will come and introduce the speaker for today. And just very quickly, as I said, she's a professor of political science and holds a PhD from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in the US, and her field of specialization are South African politics and gender politics and political behavior. So I'm sure that she's one of the advisors in this whole process of understanding some of these people that the world is producing in the US, in the UK, and of course in South Africa and most of the African countries. So Amanda, welcome, and thank you very much.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and very welcome to the STIAS lecture. If only political science could explain Trump and Boris Johnson, I would be so happy. Professor Sylvia Tamale is one of the most well-known and leading feminist scholars on the African continent, who combines her academic scholarship with activism and critical engagement with the law. I met Sylvia when we were both much younger, and I remember her as this fearless activist, and you still are. She is the coordinator of the Law, Gender and Sexuality Research Center at the School of Law at Makerere University in Uganda, and she was the first woman dean of law, as well as a visiting professor at Oxford, University of Pretoria and Zimbabwe, and currently at STIAS here at Stellenbosch. She's also an advocate of the courts of the judicature in Uganda, and she has served on several national and international boards, including the Global Commission on HIV and the law. Her scholarship has been cutting edge. Her first book, When Hens Begin to Crow, Parliamentary Politics in Uganda, was path-breaking study of gender and politics that was widely used and still is widely used. The 2011 African Sexualities Reader also makes a very important contribution to the body of African scholarship on sexuality. Today she will talk to us about peeling away the layers of colonization, the case of the African Academy. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for those kind words. First of all, I'd like to thank STIAS for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important topic. And of course, to thank each one of you for making time to come and listen to me. I want to begin by talking about Africa, how Africa is such a beautiful continent, extremely well endowed with rich and diverse resources, that is human, mineral, water, food, flora, fauna, and so forth. Its ancient and diverse cultures are so unique, and its civilization so ancient and so great, yet all but lost. In spite of this great abundance, Africa is still dismissed in global geopolitics as a backwater of shithole countries. For too long, our eyes have been blinded, ears deafened, voices stifled, minds poisoned, and histories erased by the ravages of colonization and globalization. That is why decolonization and reconstruction must be taken very, very seriously. And when we talk about decolonization, we're not indulging in a desire to return to a romanticized pre-colonial past. We all remember the students' protests in this country that culminated into the 2015 fallist movements under the hashtags Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. Those movements challenged institutional racism and classism within the academy and beyond. These growing rumblings and unrest among post-colonials have been a source of anxiety to the colonizers and their agents, who started appropriating the language of decolonization. Decolonization for the colonizers is cosmetic, steeped in liberal understandings of power and democracy. But the current times, when globalization and the immigration of thousands of Africans is driving seismic shifts in global politics, call for us to lend new urgency to this Africa-centered project. It is useful to speak of coloniality at two fundamental levels. The first involves the expropriation of indigenous worlds by the imperial colonizers. This form included the appropriation of indigenous peoples and their ecological spaces for the benefit of imperialism. For Africa, the watershed of European colonization was marked with the capturing of the first African slaves who were taken to America in 1619. Through slavery, Africans were othered as uncivilized and inferior savages. Having commenced with the traffic of our people, European imperialists then proceeded to directly plunder Africa's land and resources. They moved in to pillage raw materials. A key instrument in this pillage was the use of cheap labor. Africa also opened up new markets for Europe's finished products. The scramble for Africa's land, marked by inter-imperialist wars and disputes, culminated in the 1884 Berlin Conference, which formalized imperial claims to African territory. This type of colonization symbolically ended with flag independence in the latter half of the 20th century. However, as we all know, flag independence did not effectively end the exploitation, oppression, and violence of imperialism in the former colonies. Jamaican scholar Sylvia described it as achieving map emancipation without territorial emancipation. The end of formal colonialism triggered the start of neocolonialism, New strategies to maintain colonial power over independent Africa are in many ways more dangerous because the colonizers are not accountable for their exploitative pursuits. Today, Africa is indirectly dominated by neoliberal institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and WTO, which run the neocolonial machinery and wield significant power on the global landscape. The heterocapitalist system, facilitated by nation states, continues to extract from ex-colonies to feed the insatiable appetites of colonial powers. Colonized lands continue to supply cheap labor, minerals, oil, sand, cash and food crops, fish, etc., for the benefit of both capitalism and colonialism. The post-colonial subjects continue to suffer, and their environment continues to be depleted under the hands of imperialists and their agents on the ground. So slavery, direct colonization, and neocolonialism together represent the first level of colonialism, whose structural legacies shape our political economies. Decolonization calls for a dismantling of the capitalist neoliberal system. Hence, the transformation of Africa's economies and state political structures constitutes a different, albeit closely linked, form of decolonization from that addressed at the second level. The second level of coloniality was and still is much more insidious and dangerous. It operates in subtle and benign ways. Its ideologies are inculcated through institutions such as education, religion, laws, family, language, corrupted cultural practices, and mass media. It involves the colonization of the mind, patterns of knowledge, and social structures of indigenous peoples. Ngugi wa Thiong'o summed it up quite poignantly. And I quote, "Berlin of 1884 was effected through the sword and the bullet, but the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and blackboard. The physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom. But where the former was visibly brutal, the latter was visibly gentle." Such appropriation of the world by the West continues today through the phenomenon of globalization. This form of psychological colonization renders the identity of the colonized a very precarious unity. Internalized colonization is so deeply embedded and our context so enlivened with colonial logic that our intuitive responses to change are usually negative. It blurs our vision and restricts our potential to imagine a different world, a world where everything Western is deemed to be inherently superior to anything indigenous. Consequently, when we speak of decolonization, the process of breaking free must target both levels of colonization if it is to be effective. Decolonization at the second level involves the conscious resistance to internalized colonial structures of thought. It is designed to reject essentialization, stereotypes, and biases of colonial-dominated hegemonies. It is a social justice project, but it is quite distinct from the human rights project. While both projects seek social change, the decolonization project recognizes that the historical basis of the human rights project lies in the dominant colonial ideology that it is challenging. Decolonization calls for social transformation that is more disruptive than the quest for human rights. While the human rights project comes from a Western liberal ethic, the project of decolonization recognizes indigenous knowledge frameworks. It entails much more than the simple decolonization of course reading materials. Its purpose is to aid both educators and learners. Its purpose is to aid both educators and learners lift the veil to uncover colonialism and its legacies, to analyze colonial histories and values in search of ethics that reject domination and exploitation, and to articulate critiques of colonial ontologies. and epistemologies, those big words. This afternoon, I'm going to briefly discuss 5 layers of colonization that we have to painstakingly peel away to rid ourselves of second-level decolonization in our institutions of higher learning. The 5 layers of subsystems of colonization lie on a potent kernel, or think of it as software, which is the engine that pumps fuel into the veins of the layers. That kernel is called internalized colonialism. So in Decolonizing the Academy, I will spend some time discussing how internalized colonialism operates before tackling the 5 layers that we need to peel away from their launch engine. The first layer consists of institutional ethos, that is, the fundamental character and culture of the university. Does that culture perpetuate colonial hegemony, or does it deliberately invalidate it? Does it give space and preeminence to colonial legacies, or does it validate indigenous and alternative worldviews? Layer 2 reveals the content of the curricula, while the third layer accounts for the pedagogical approaches which are deployed in the academy. Do these work to keep colonialism alive, or do they promote critical learning and reflexive practice? The fourth layer is composed of research politics and questions the ontological and epistemological assumptions of dominant Eurocentric discourses. The final outermost layer represents inclusiveness of diversities. Do the demographics of students, staff, and administrators, as well as policies, reflect equitable and inclusive practices? And beyond the numbers, what is the quality of life of the people in those statistics? I argue that peeling away one layer while leaving the others intact results in a truncated and ineffective decolonization process. But as a precondition to peeling away the layers, we must understand the workings of the core kernel. So I'm beginning with internalized colonialism, how it is achieved. Everyone in the world is affected by colonization. It is structural, it is institutional, it is systemic, and it is effective. In short, colonial power is diffused, and all of us, even those responsible for its perpetuation, are victims of internalized colonialism and its ideologies. Its logic is deeply ingrained in our daily lives. That is how powerful and pervasive colonialism and its legacies are. That is why the first target in the process of decolonization must be our mentalities and our consciousness. Such an approach is key to clearing our perception and developing a 2020 vision on what a decolonized academy would look like. Some of us are privileged and valorized by colonial oppression and hegemony, while others are dehumanized and decivilized by it. Very few of us would dare admit the extent that colonialism and neocolonialism affects us. The impulse is to either be defensive or offensive. My appeal is that this afternoon we all step back and engage in serious self-reflection and introspection as we collectively try to understand the fraught and complex issues of this global transnational phenomenon. As intellectuals in the academy, it is our duty, nay, our obligation to do so. The phrase colonized mind was coined by the Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire. He was attempting to describe the invisible ways that colonizers continue with their oppression even after dismantling the physical architecture of colonialism. He highlighted the flaws in the pedagogical approaches of the contemporary educational system, where both the teacher and the student play a mechanistic and passive role in the learning processes. Colonialism affects the way we think, the way we speak, and the way we act. We all internalize its worldview, including its constructed superiority and inferiority statuses. This is what makes colonialism so insidious. Decolonization refers to a process of deconstructing colonial interpretations and analysis of the social world. This is very much in line with what the post-colonial philosopher Frantz Fanon had in mind when he wrote The Wretched of the Earth. For us, the colonized, decolonization of the mind is really about returning to the annals of history to find ourselves, to become fluent in our cultural knowledge systems, to cultivate critical consciousness, and to reclaim our humanity. What makes colonization of the mind so effective is that its constructions are made to appear natural. When something is presented as natural, logic transmits the cognitive message that it is inevitable and unchangeable. It works to rationalize and justify racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, and all the other isms that we live with on a daily basis. Naturalization and normalization of social hierarchies are derived from ideas such as divine laws. So in order to effectively break this cycle of colonization, we must fully understand the concept of decolonization and how it can set us on the road to more dignified ways of living in this world. But before we delve into a discussion of decolonizing minds, we must fully appreciate how they were colonized in the first place. I'll proceed to discuss 4 different but interlinked processes through which the Imperial project achieved its goal of colonizing the mind, offering examples to demonstrate how each process works. The first one is through othering. Theorists like Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak offer us conceptual clarity regarding the need of the empire to define itself against those that it is colonizing. They explain that the imperial definition of self is dependent upon its other. The process of othering is a way to enact difference and to justify existing power inequalities in a democratic dispensation. It involves identifying the us from the them in opposition to each other. So how do we learn who we are and how we fit into the us? How do we learn where we stand in the various social hierarchies, whether it's racial, gender, class, etc.? It is by learning how to differentiate our self from the other. In other words, it is through othering. In her book, Strange Encounters, Sarah Ahmed challenges our common understanding of the term stranger. The Oxford Dictionary defines stranger as, and I quote, a person whom one does not know or with whom one is not familiar. However, Ahmed challenges this definition by arguing that knowledge is constructed in such a way that we know who we are through understanding what we are not. I know I am white because I'm not black. I am a man because I'm not a woman. I'm well-to-do because I'm not impoverished. I'm straight because I'm not gay. I'm able-bodied because I'm not disabled. So literally, I am because you are not. Our sense of belonging derives from recognizing the difference of the other, the stranger. In that sense, the stranger is socially constructed as someone we already know. For example, I was not a stranger to the group of young white men who made monkey noises and beat their chests at me a few months ago on a street in Belgium. Colonial constructions of my difference had acquainted me to them well before I flew to Belgium. Their feelings of hatred and fear towards me had been planted in their minds, couched in the positive language of love to their nation, to their community, and to their selves. Instead of teaching them to hate blacks, the imperial power teaches them to love those that are like them, the us. Those young men recognize themselves through a discursive construction of me as out of place, as an alien, and therefore potentially dangerous. My difference sealed their sameness. They viewed me as the other, who threatened the coherence and stability of their community, indeed their nation. Through invisibilization, Colonialism undervalues non-Western forms of knowledge construction and their ways of being, rendering them invisible. What do I mean? Knowledge itself is generally constructed through colonial educational ideals. Indigenous realities and ways of knowing, for example, are often ignored and/or marginalized. Through neocolonial practices, such knowledges are delegitimated and excluded from academic canon. On February 13th this year, for example, BBC News reported that pangolins, those shy, nocturnal, scaly anteaters, were the most trafficked mammals in the world. The report said, and I quote, "The little-known pangolin is the most trafficked mammal in the world, leading to fears it could become extinct," end quotes. The intrinsic contradiction and inconsistency in this report was totally lost on the British scientists and the reporters. If an animal is hunted to the extent of near extinction, logic tells us that its captors must know a great deal about it. Clearly, it is not little known. Never mind that the pangolin, or olugave, is an important totem traditionally protected in the Kiganda clan system for centuries, as it is in many other indigenous communities in which this animal was once common. But just as the colonialists, Christopher Columbus, discovered America in 1492, and John Speke discovered the source of the Nile in 1858, obviously, the native knower of the pangolin does not count. Indigenous knowledge does not qualify as science. The knowledge constructions of indigenous people are at once disappeared and invisibilized. Through binarization and universalization. Imperial construction of human relations is through rigid binary frames: black, white, female, male, feminine, masculine, straight, gay, able-bodied, disabled, rich, poor, beautiful, ugly, and so on. And yet we know that humanity is much more complex and diverse than mainstream ideologies would like us to believe. The infinite shades of gray that nuance our lives are erased. If there is only black and white, then where do you place categories like mixed race, intersex, hijra, bisexual, transgender? The assumption that there exists a core essence to culture or human nature is just that, an assumption. Unfortunately, it is a wrong assumption. The ontological and epistemological knowledge constructions of indigenous peoples around the world have always understood the complexity, multiplicity, and fluidity of humans. To appreciate what I'm talking about, you just need to read about third genders, such as the Hijra of India, the Mioxis of Mexico, the Mudoko Dako of Uganda, the Katoi of Thailand, and the two-spirited people, or Badash, among the Native Americans. All these examples of sex, gender diverse people at once disrupt the dichotomized forms of identity classification current in colonial systems of knowing and being. They reinscribe binary understandings to the nuanced spectrum, the continuum of human experience and learning. They move us from the exclusion implicit in othering to inclusive acknowledgements. The ontological and epistemological binary system that we're exposed to orients us into a normative logic of binary thinking. It locks us into a system of structural inequality whereby we view the us in opposition to some other. The inequality is based on the belief that the other lacks some desirable characteristic that the us has. It is such a mentality that perpetuates exclusionary worldviews even among colonized communities themselves. There are no essential qualities to being. The reality is that all binary distinctions are strategically constructed and universalized to serve colonial vested interests. The constructed essence or norms are then used as a basis to police and punish those that deviate from the constructed norm. Our identities are many, but we are much more than the sum total of them. The identities that make us who we are intersect not additively, but multiplicatively. Our different selves or identities intertwine in complex ways and at various levels to result in dominance and inequalities. Finally, our minds are colonized through pseudoscience. In the mid-20th century, there was a proliferation of political economy scholarship which sought to analyze the capitalist system. One of the charges that such scholarship proffered against science was that it played a key role in legitimizing the interests of colonialism, particularly justifying discrimination. Science lends authority to knowledge claims that become difficult to refute. Good examples can be seen in social anthropology and evolutionary science, which provided the main oxygen and lifeblood to racialist social paradigms. In fact, as Quijano tells us, and I quote, "The idea of race in its modern meaning does not have a known history before the colonization of America. Race and racial identity were established as instruments of basic social classification," end quotes. The ideologies that amplify the significance of racial differences are so effective that they are deeply embedded in our psyches, and for most of us, very difficult to shake off. The Caucasian is strategically constructed as superior, while the African is placed at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, closest to apes in the mapping of species. Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory provided the doctrine for white supremacy. In his 1871 book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin laced his evolutionary theory with imperialist, racist, and sexist overtones aligned with British colonialism. He described the Western nations of Europe to have, and I quote, "so immeasurably surpassed their former savage progenitors and stand at the summit of civilization," end quotes. He then went on to contrast this civilized race to non-European savage races and declared that, and I quote, "the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races through the world," end quotes. Such discourse was the moral platform, the raison d'etre that imperialists like Cecil Rhodes needed to expand territories, to plunder, exploit, and enslave. Hence, through social Darwinism, the colonizers convinced themselves and the rest of the world of the white man's burden to civilize the world. Indeed, Darwin's work was welcomed by all colonialists and perpetrators of racist genocide throughout the world. It still guides the thinking of contemporary racist ideologies that wrongly construct evolution as a linear progression instead of an intricate branching of limbs of an ever-growing tree. Darwin's sexist theory of sexual selection also attempted to demonstrate the innate passivity of women and their natural subordination. The fact is that all living organisms, including humans, plants, and animals, evolved from a single organism which is now extinct, a single stem from which all living things branch off with adaptations to their environment. Indeed, most indigenous knowledge systems view the social world through a spiritual connection with all life forms. For them, there is no division between matter, mind, and spirit. Race is forced on us. The meaning attached to our skin color and other outward physical attributes is definitely a social construction, an arbitrary fiction. It is a colonial construction based merely on people's phenotype. Indeed, studies have found that two Europeans are not necessarily more likely to be genetically similar than any two Europeans. White supremacist ideologies deliberately exaggerate phenotype differences. They also obscure the differences between the concepts of genotype and phenotype to rationalize racist systems. Proof that race has no basis in biology is the fact that at different points in history, it has found different permutations. Hence, Nazi Germany enacted laws that marked Jews and Gypsies as impure non-Aryans. The one-drop rule still dominates understandings of race in the United States. There is a time in the US when the Irish, Italians, and Jews were not considered white. A white person in Brazil today is considered black in the US. And racial identity in this country, South Africa, was at some point assessed using a simplistic pencil test. So historically, constructed races have been used to rationalize privilege and to stigmatize, to justify prejudices and exclusion. People internalize the interlocking hierarchies that create systems of privilege and disadvantage in deeply personal ways. Part of the challenge of decolonization is to disentangle and unravel these deeply embedded connections between personal, political, and social structures, and to end their recycle. The very nature of the academy is borrowed from the colonial structures meant to commodify knowledge and produce an elite class in society that dominate power and resources. Like our political institutions, the African Academy was modeled on the academies in the metropole, complete with donated imperialist texts and the assumption that they would serve our needs. If the African university mimics Western universities to date, is it any wonder that Africa's best brains are routinely drained to the West? What would decolonized universities look like? So I move on to decolonizing the African Academy. Now that we have some idea of how our minds are colonized, with the educational institutions directly implicated in the process, what are we to do? How can we transform the academy from its current elitist and dominant colonial paradigms? Such a lecture obviously cannot go into the nuts and bolts details of how to implement decolonization. So what I provide below is a general framework for embarking on the process of decolonization, which would require us to peel away the other layers of colonization. So I go back to our layers, beginning with the institutional ethos. This involves transforming the very ethos and culture of the institution. The culture of an institution determines its change processes and strategies. Is the university run like a corporation with a CEO sitting on top of a power pyramid with disgruntled workers and students viewed as cash cows or products to be churned out like an assembly line? Has the academy become a marketplace for making profit? To what extent are university programs and their curricula geared towards addressing current global and national crises? Does the university aim at producing graduates who are historical conscious and society conscious to fight social inequalities? Philosopher Achille Mbembe asks the pointed question: what are the limits placed on the decolonization project by the forces of neoliberalism? A conducive culture does not drown students in unnecessary bureaucracies and outdated administrative practices. A responsive institutional ethos acknowledges diverse needs and vulnerabilities. It treats everyone, regardless of status, with respect, courtesy, and fairness. It works very hard to create bridges and flatten hierarchies. Community members will not fully engage or feel truly valued unless their rights and beliefs are respected regardless of race, gender, origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, age, marital status, and so on. Internalized colonization must be unlearned by those oppressed by it and those privileged by it, both. Does your university feel like a military barracks or a detention camp? Are you policed by the administration faculty members, students, or support staff? Is your potential reduced to standardized tests and gradation? Are the administrators more interested in the quantitative ranking of your institution than its qualitative improvement? Do you feel out of the loop and alienated from university culture? Is academic freedom part of the institutional culture of your university? Does your university demand for government to play its role in supporting public education in a substantive way? Or does it only call upon government to bring in the tear gas whenever it faces a grassroots rebellion? What about your university supporting open access to knowledge, to multivocal literature, including grey literature, oral documents, such as orations, stories, songs, folklore, proverbs, riddles, games, artworks, and ceremonies? I believe that the commodification of knowledge production is criminal. Capitalism will squeeze coins out of anything and exploit anything to make that extra profit. Educators and learners need open access to all published works because no individual can claim to be the exclusive producer of knowledge. We all build on existing knowledge and restate old arguments in different words. We base our conclusions on research data given to us by others, so we do not own that knowledge. Publishers should not make profit off academic publications because it is public knowledge. The institutional ethos makes the difference between students looking forward to or dreading the learning experience, and between academics thriving or barely surviving in the academy. Curricular content. The bulk of what we learn and teach in the African Academy is colonial, in that it is deeply rooted in Western philosophical thought and not grounded in the lived realities of its people. Moreover, coloniality acts as the epistemological center and reference point for knowledge, as our histories are designed as a process of Europeanization. So, for example, we talk about pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. No discipline is spared from such one-sided colonial bias. In the legal academy, for example, regardless of whether we follow the common law or civil law tradition, the prevalent conception of law is positivism. The formalistic positivist approach stresses black letter law, that is the legal rules, at the expense of both legal philosophy and the society in which law operates. This is at direct odds with living customary law, which cannot be abstracted from its social context. The ultimate outcome of these gigantic curricular blind spots that invisibilize our indigenous histories, languages, ways of knowing and being, is to instill and perpetuate internalized colonialism. A loss of one's history is equivalent to a loss of one's self, a loss of one's soul. Cheikh Anta Diop was convinced that an African Renaissance depended upon Africa rediscovering its historical memory, that is, prehistory beyond pre-colonial. His transdisciplinary study of Egyptology helped deconstruct Eurocentric epistemologies and to construct an alternative epistemology and philosophy of history and African relations. Diop and others, like Martin Barno, have constructed important counter-narratives that relocate classical civilization from Greece to Africa and Asia. Moreover, most of the content of these curricula rely upon static notions of culture and identity and impart no critical analytical skills. It is deplorable that 6 decades after flag independence, no African state has undertaken any radical overhaul of the colonial education systems left behind by the imperialists. The few attempts made to change the content of colonial education have only resulted in cosmetic reforms without realizing any paradigmatic shifts. Perhaps Tanzania made the best efforts on the continent to indigenize their curricula, but their science curricula remains colonial. Interestingly, many Tanzanian parents who can afford it send off their parents to study in neighboring Kenya and Uganda, or even beyond, preferring the dominant colonial curricula. Michel Foucault coined the concept of power knowledge to illuminate the inextricable link between the two entities. He explained that power knowledge can be limiting, but also liberating. Colonial education procedure produces knowledge that influences our activities and existence, in the process reinforcing colonial interests. Hence, curriculum development is a significant tool for the decolonization project. Not only would indigenizing the curriculum validate multiple cultural knowledges, but it would also produce more reflective and proactive learners, given the familiarity of the content. Hence, it is important to purposively and thoughtfully interweave indigenous content into curricular frameworks that are informed by indigenous ontologies and epistemologies. It does not make sense, for example, for a science curriculum to ignore traditional ecological knowledge that has been developed through generations of contact by indigenous peoples with their lands. Instead, such knowledge is currently sought after by Western neocolonial interests that appropriate it through the manipulation of intellectual property rights. Restructuring the curricula must start at the elementary level, primary level, where the process of colonial indoctrination and whitewashing begins. Indigenization of the curriculum would be revolutionary by integrating African cultural values, beliefs, practices, norms, and institutions into its content in a transdisciplinary fashion. A transdisciplinary curriculum is one that transcends disciplines and integrates various perspectives and approaches. The complex problems that Africa faces cannot be solved by monodisciplinary, specialized, and fragmented approaches that are far removed from the lived realities of society. China offers a model example where Guangzhou University of Chinese Medicine alone boasts of 19 doctoral programs in Chinese medicine and herbal Chinese medicine, as well as 24 master's programs that integrate Chinese medicine with Western medicine. A history curriculum in an African academy that includes a full module on the French Revolution but is silent about the Haitian Revolution is as ridiculous as teaching a Nigerian art student about Michelangelo and not Ben Nwonu or Felix Edubo. Pedagogical approaches. The colonial legacy that imposed Eurocentric dominance and situated it as the universal epistemological paradigm is clearly evident in current pedagogical approaches of contemporary academies. The importance of how knowledge is imparted in education systems cannot be overemphasized. Who benefits from students learning through competitive processes and from commodifying knowledge itself? Raymond Williams urges us to, and I quote, emphasize not the ladder, but the common highway, end quotes. The relationship between lecturers and students, as well as the methods of teaching, should be democratic, inclusive, validating the voices of all learners. Pedagogical methods should promote cognitive holistic learning beyond dichotomized approaches and rote content knowledge. They should resonate with the learner's worldviews and beliefs. Freire criticizes the dominant teaching method, where students are viewed as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge transmitted by their teachers. The incorrect assumption underlying this method is that the student lacks any knowledge and the teacher possesses all of it. Antonio Gramsci also argued that, and I quote, every teacher is always a pupil and every pupil a teacher, end quotes. The colonial education system is set up in such a way that the participants are largely unaware of their roles as colonizer or colonized. Both are caught in the grip of the colonial relationship. It is all hidden in the curricula, policies, textbooks, authority structures, credentialism, methods, cultural contexts, and the overall hegemonic discourses. Sometimes there will be a rejection on the part of the teacher and/or the student, but overall, these pockets of resistance amount to small ripples that hardly cause a dent in the dominant and hegemonic forces. Liberatory teaching methods should hone the critical thinking skills of learners. Unlearning or conscientization requires exposure to knowledge and understanding of the historical processes of colonial domination and Western modernity. Such histories would unlock the concealed truths about the Western modernity project, which was achieved at the great expense of indigenous populations. Unlearning entails appreciating indigenous knowledge systems and their ways of being, which were subordinated by coloniality. Unlearning also means that we consciously and constantly engage in self-reflection, questioning all assumptions and prejudices underlying colonially constructed truths. Finally, it entails resisting from perpetuating essentializing stereotypes about colonized people. Conscientization through dialogue between the lecturer and the students is a process of two-way learning, knowing and theorizing about the shared experiences. Studies have shown that students learn better through storytelling, for example, than the passive lecture method. Storytelling is a common method of transferring knowledge within indigenous knowledge systems, as are participatory hands-on learning, community-based learning, and collaborative inquiry. A few academies on the continent have embarked on serious decolonizing programs. The Marcus Garvey Pan-African University, founded by Professor Wadada Naudere in eastern Uganda, is one such example. In addition to on-campus learning within the four walls of a lecture room, the university has set up off-campus centers where students engage with the local communities. The university's radical curricula, based on the philosophy of Africology, spelled with a K, seeks to reinstate and mainstream indigenous knowledge systems that were distorted by Greece and Rome. Through the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, the University of Johannesburg is another example of an institution that has radically transformed its curriculum, placing Africa at its epistemic center. Unfortunately, many of such efforts on the continent experience serious pushback from the national regulatory bodies in charge of higher education and those whose minds continue to be locked within the cage of coloniality. Finally, using indigenous languages as a medium of learning is crucial in the decolonization process, as colonial languages alienate and silence many African students in our academies. Teaching in one indigenous language can be challenging in African academies whose states were patched together without any sensitivity to homogenizing criteria by the Berlin imperialists. But Tanzania managed to overcome the linguistic barrier by adopting Swahili as a national language. Texts can be published in local languages with translations of a homogenizing language. Research politics. The academy is a hub of scholarly research which powerfully shapes discourse and is heavily relied upon for public policy and governance. Do the theoretical connotations of the research conducted in your university perpetuate colonial concepts, stereotypes, imaginaries, and cover-ups? The dominant positivist paradigm in both the hard and social sciences emphasizes objectivity and a dichotomy between subject and object. It depicts social reality as being out there and calls for scientific approaches of obtaining such reality through unrealistic detachment and objectivity. It presupposes abstract researchers devoid of history and unaffected by culture, gender, and cultural structures. A positivist researcher is supposed to look like that. These colonial patriarchal ways of relating to the world are extremely problematic as they tend to produce skewed and biased knowledge. We need to adopt ethical, non-positivist intellectual paradigms that acknowledge subjective interpretation of reality and are commensurate with indigenous knowledge systems. We need to fully understand the reasons behind the facts before we can engender social transformation. Neutral knowledge does not exist. Knowledge production, or what and how we understand reality and truth, is an extreme political process. What is reality or truth? How do we know this reality? Is there only one reality, or are there many realities? Are these realities universal? In the world we live in today, knowledge structures are mainly shaped by colonial ontology and epistemology. Most approaches to these philosophical questions are answered by mainstream colonial values and colonial ways of knowing and being. Such approaches reinforce colonial hegemonic relations. In this era of bought algorithms, the sky is the limit for constructing and sustaining such master narratives. Decolonizing research would entail processes that value, reclaim, and foreground indigenous voices and ways of knowing. Apart from critiquing colonial research paradigms and methods, decolonized research would question and deconstruct the very premise on which concepts are based, its underlying assumptions, values, and motivations. It would build synergies between various knowledge systems in a non-hierarchical fashion. Tuhiwai Smith cautions against researchers who view themselves as authoritative representatives of the other, with their findings universalized while marginalizing the voices of the other. She further critiques the practices of history, writing, and theory making, exposing their imperialist bias. Her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, is a must-read for those interested in a decolonized research agenda. Moving on to inclusiveness of diversities. Decolonization requires that we are more tolerant of diversity and pluralism. Here, we are not talking about cosmetic or tokenistic approaches to diversity. Mbembe refers to it as the democratization of access, whereby the doors of higher education should be widely opened. How welcoming is your university to diverse users and beliefs? What inclusive policies are in place? On access buildings, for example, diverse-friendly signages, etc. Is there an affirmative action program in your university to achieve both quantitative and qualitative equity? For example, are there plans to incorporate disadvantaged and alienated groups, such as women, people of color, LGBTIQ, the impoverished at all levels, administration, student, lecturers, and staff? What about academic support programs to counter the effects of schooling deficits? When the demographics reflect those of the wider population, do the people that populate the university own the space, or do they feel out of place? In discussing decolonization of the academy, Day speaks of voice affirmation, authenticity of selves, epistemic saliency of the experience of the colonized populations. The academy should recognize the intellectual agency of colonial subjects and the validity of learning beyond oneself and the self-referential. The decolonization project must not parochially focus on the damage that racist ideologies and practices have done to African academies, but also be critical of the other related isms created by colonial encounters and inequities. In particular, decolonization must pay attention to all systems of oppression that intersect with racism, including gender, socioeconomic status, age, disability, and so forth. The students' fallist movements here in South Africa, for example, were criticized by feminists for their militarized hypermasculinity and homophobic overtones. To conclude, as we've seen, peeling away the different layers of colonization and decolonizing the academy is a tall order. Colonization of the mind was possible because Europe had the power to impose its version of the world on other communities around the world. Such an imposition was achieved through brute force and even more powerfully through imaginative force. The empire entrenched a system that comprehensively indoctrinates African students with unquestioned Eurocentrism that guarantees perpetual life to neocolonial ideologies and its adherents. The neocolonial graduate will guarantee colonial continuity around the continent, in schools, in government, in parliament, in the courtrooms, in the banks, in industry, in the media, and in healthcare. Politics plays a very important role in the construction of knowledge. Decolonization of the academy and of the mind must be seen as only a first step. Given how embedded and ubiquitous dominant colonial knowledges, values, and languages are, decolonization appears to be a huge and daunting project. In order to unhinge the deep systemic colonial structures and assumptions, a careful systematic decolonization program has to be devised. It is not about emptying the old pot and simply replacing its contents. It requires us to smash the pot and return to the river for fresh clay to mold a completely new pot. Not only a new academy with new ideologies, narratives, values, and practices, but also an entirely fresh Afrocentric education system, starting from elementary school. Achieving the above goals is not easy feat. It would certainly take much more than an afternoon's keynote to reflect upon and discuss the nuts and bolts of implementing decolonization processes in our academies. The good news is that many before us have reflected upon this important issue. A rich body of literature exists on decolonization that provides us with theoretical and practical guidelines on how such programs may unfold. Decolonized knowledge production should benefit from a cross-pollination of ideas, values, and perspectives, taking into account the dynamism of all knowledge systems. For instance, local knowledges regarding soil types, vegetation patterns, plant pharmacology, and architectural designs may instruct us on suitable environmental practices. In reimagining our decolonized academies, we must be ready to shed familiar approaches that put an all-knowing professor at a lectern, commandeering lectures within the walls of a lecture hall. Mbembe speaks of future knowledges based on reinvented wall-less classrooms, in which we are all co-learners, a university that is capable of convening various publics in new forms of assemblies that become points of convergence of and platforms for the redistribution of different kinds of knowledges. We must also take care not to simply graft indigenous knowledges onto dominant colonial approaches. The idea is not to simply introduce a separate course on indigenous knowledge systems, but rather to integrate them in all university disciplines. And because the ultimate goal of decolonization is social justice, elements of indigenous knowledges that reinforce inequalities must be rejected. Achieving all this would not only require the retraining of lecturers, but also making space for custodians of indigenous knowledges in the academy. When the academy ignores the debilitating legacies of colonialism, when it works to defend and whitewash colonialism, it is directly complicit in perpetuating colonial oppression and colonial discourses. Such transformative changes will of course invoke emotive resistance and cynicism, especially from the minority that benefit from colonial legacies. But ultimately, decolonizing the mind and the academy will benefit the broader world community and lead to a more just societies. Our university ideals should not be based on the tradition of I am because you are not, but rather on the non-colonial ethos of I am because we are. Decolonization is about us as Africans, recentering, rehumanizing, reconstructing, and resisting. The decolonization of African academies and education systems would ultimately deal a significant blow to imperialism, racism, and national chauvinism. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Sylvia, for a very thought-provoking talk. We have a few minutes left, so if there are any questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious about the role of law in the decoloniality project, because the main problem that is encountered is that the law is deeply colonial. The chicken thief is put in for 7 years. The politician who is the thief is given bail. So, and the law defines and governs the way we operate. How can we decolonize Africa and the mind when the law is in fact in protecting the colonial hegemony, especially in the mind of
Okay, since we're talking about the academy here, I'm going to talk about the legal academy. The teaching of law, as you correctly point out, the law that we teach is based on, it was literally copied, cut, and pasted onto the colonies. So you find exactly the same wording. Actually, it's not even the same wording, because those laws in the metropoles have since moved on. Ours, the wording, even the commas, are the same as, the laws that are no longer laws in Paris or London. But it's the theoretical underpinnings, the jurisprudence that informs those laws that we must look at. Because, when you teach a lawyer, they're going to go on and practice the law and sit in judgment of others using that law. So even in countries like South Africa, which has the best jurisprudence when it comes to trying to decolonize their laws, a judge will sit and talk about customary law as trying to justify it as living law, that it's not static, it changes with the times, with the context, and so on. And then the reasoning that that judge is using is steeped in the law that he learned in law school, which is that the problem, I was reading a case the other day, the problem with living customary law is how to ascertain it, how to prove it. So now he's going back in the mode of the Eurocentric laws that he learned, that you must prove, the very positivistic, you must prove, which is very different. If that judge, for example, had been trained in the philosophy of legal pluralism, of living customary law, they would not be trying to see ways of proving, imposing precedent on living customary law. So it is really changing around the way we think about the law and everything else, because it's become part of our DNA that most of us cannot even begin imagining how else to think about our disciplines, because it's become part of our DNA. It is so hegemonic. But it is those philosophical underpinnings that undergird the principles that we know that have a problem in our context. There was another hand behind that. Maybe.
Yeah. So I think that I really like your lecture, and thank you very much. It's very stimulating and thought-provoking. My worry usually with issues around colonialization and how you can decolonize is that we are dynamic individuals. So my worry is that usually when we talk decolonization, we want to press a reset. So as you say, we have to change the way we think, but that way we think is also dynamic. So I think the challenge, the academy, African academies have is to press that reset button, conscious that the system in which the African reality would be best is itself dynamic. So it has been changing with time. How we can address that, I have no clue. So my simple question is, how can we press that reset button whilst taking into cognizance the fact that we are dynamic?
Let me give the example of the philosophical thinking in Western liberalism that thinks in dualisms, okay, either or, mostly in opposition to each other and hierarchized. And most non-Western ways of thinking is in a spectrum. Okay? How is that going to change? In other words, we are saying there's a lot of gray area between your two extremes. So we are talking about underlying philosophies that inform how we think. So when you say that it's dynamic, it's going to change, how would that change? I mean, we don't have men and women. Between men and women, there are so many things in between. And that truism, which informs the way we think, is not going to change. So you think we'll change one day and say it's dual?
Thank you, Prof. My question is on the issue of resisting that you talked about. Any advice that you could give in creating new forms of knowledge in the academy and resisting the current status quo when, for example, what to study or themes to study is well controlled through systems of grants and funding. For example, to study a PhD I have a friend who's studying a PhD in drama and theater focusing on sex workers, and to get funding for that, it is so difficult even to navigate to such that the work ends up not being, you have the zeal, you can see the gap, but how then do we resist when the academy is so closed up to bringing in new forms of knowledge or themes in knowledge?
Yes. The academy as it is today has such a grip on the way we do things and how we do them And I think that is why it is so effective. I think it was not by accident that Cecil Rhodes, with all his riches, his estate, he bequeathed the biggest percentage of his estate to education. Because that's where it all starts. That's how, that guarantees continuity in fashioning people, molding people in a certain way of thinking and doing things. So how do we resist on a PhD program in the current structures would probably lead you to be ejected out of the system because you haven't changed the rules. You have, as I said, get new clay and mold a new institution. As it is today, we still play by the old rules, the same colonial rules, which we have to change. And as I said, peeling away one and leaving the others is not going to do it. So, yes, the grants, it's all tied, it's all connected.
Thank you, Sylvia. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just want to say, I think there's listening to react to something and there's listening to understand, and it's about reflecting on what each of us are doing in the academy to bring about the changes. And I think, as a feminist scholar, and Sylvia's also one, there are lessons to be learned from feminist literature, because we had to go into male-dominated sciences and the male-dominated academy and work and bring about new knowledge that resist and counter that knowledge. So thank you for your talk and for making us aware what we need to reflect upon.
Thank you.
And thank you for your presence.